there, welcome to another episode of an ongoing series where we basically take the camera anywhere we want to try to find secrets and new discoveries to some of our favorite games. And today, we got a real special episode. We're finally covering Sonic the Hedgehog 1 and 2. And for that animated intro, I just wanted to thank real quick Channy and Kimberly, who are animators on this platform, and you can have links to them down below. And also, one of the tools that's used in this episode is the Sonic level editor to be able to talk about some of the other things that we won't be able to talk about with just the in-game assets. So, with that said, we have found a lot of things in Sonic 1 and a few things in Sonic 2. I actually thought it would be the other way around, but I was very wrong about that. So, let me show you what I found, and yeah, let's jump into it. So the first thing that I want to talk about is stuff that is found out of bounds, because games like this, you don't usually see objects just kind of stored in the out of bounds areas. And some of this stuff, by the way, was really hard to find because of the fact that debug mode on all these games are still a bit of a controlled experience. The camera will still kind of guide you to where it wants you to see things. Sometimes it doesn't work properly, it doesn't work exactly the way that they would want it to, and sometimes you can go well outside the boundaries. But thanks to the level editor tool, I noticed something really far outside the boundaries, and when I looked at it up close, I realized it's a rock. But not only that, if I do use the debug camera in the game, there is a glitch that allows me to go well outside the boundaries and see the rock in-game myself. What the heck it's doing here is probably just a leftover left by the developers that they didn't realize that they placed. But that's not the only thing that was kind of unused and not needed. Like in Labyrinth Zone here, if you remove this layer, you can see that there's a whole row of spikes that goes completely unused. Although, funny enough, this is actually in the exact same coordinate as the row of spikes in a different act of Labyrinth Zone. So it's possible that Act 1 was actually built off of Act 2, and they just forgot to delete that asset. Another example of something way outside the boundaries, and unfortunately, I can't actually show you this one in-game because the camera works as it's intended in debug mode. But far, far below this tunnel area in this act, you could see an unused yellow spring. Even with how the level editor tool works, I couldn't even show you this up close. I had to grab the spring and bring it inbounds just to show you. Also in Marble Zone, there's some unused spikes over here. And then I wanted to show you that at this particular instance, the camera doesn't work quite as intended, and if you move fast enough, you can catch a glimpse of these spikes that are actually resting above a gap in between the environment and the spikes themselves. Something that you don't normally get to see in game, so it is really neat to see that. But we're not here to just see funny things with the environment. You came here to see unused stuff, right? So towards the end of the game, in this level, there are several unused monitors that are not only hidden in the environment, but are also monitors that are simply just unused in the game entirely. They're just static monitors. And there's one that's placed here next to this ring monitor, which you can actually hit if you jump at this corner at a specific angle, which allows you to see what happens if you destroy a static monitor, which is that it just shows a little bit of a glitchy sprite for a second and then just appears to be a broken monitor. But that's not the only one that's in this stage. There's actually 3 more over here as well. And then there's this scene where a rush of lava is chasing after Sonic in a narrow hallway, and you have to get out of there in time before you get swept up by the pool of lava. And if you take the camera out, you can see that the sprite for the lava is actually not as long as you might think. Makes sense. This was originally a 4x3 game, and so having it just extend a little bit outside the boundaries is good enough, I suppose. And then next up is the infinite slide in Labyrinth Zone. So, unless you push a button, you're going to be continuously going down a slide in Labyrinth Zone without any end in sight. And how does the game pull that off? Well, if we use debug mode, we can see that we kind of hit a ceiling. But if we turn off debug mode, we can see that all of a sudden we can see above ourselves. So what's up with that? Well, the answer to that is that when you're in debug mode, you actually do hit the ceiling. And if you go all the way to the bottom in debug mode, you hit the bottom. But the game is programmed to initiate a flag when you're in play mode, which warps your character from the bottom to the top. So if you ever wanted to see what that looked like, we can use the Sonic level editor to show you a visual representation of where the top and the bottom actually is. And here's a wild one for you. At the end of Act 2 of Scrap Brain Zone, you get tricked by Dr. Robotnik and you're dropped down into this hole to go into the final act. Now, if you use debug mode to break the boundaries and get on the other side, you can find out that Dr. Robotnik here can actually be attacked. Now, his character won't disappear after you attack him, but if he hits you, you will lose rings. And if you attack him, there is an impact that basically indicates that, yeah, you took a hit point off of them. After that, though, you can't really do anything as far as interacting with them. And then in the final boss fight, you got this whole contraption here where he comes out of the ceiling and the floor, and he might end up in one of 4 quadrants. Now, taking the camera out of bounds here will show you that the device is not fully modeled at all times, but Dr. Robotnik is always somewhere on the map at any given time. But in any given moment, he usually rests in wherever he was last, and then he teleports to where he's going to be next as the animation starts. And the special stage is definitely the crowning moment of Sonic 1. Going out of bounds in the special stage will eventually get you to hit a collection of RAM data, which ends up getting physical representation. Now, part of this, though, is that you actually get to see unused objects in this area, too. Like, for example, there's an emblem with Sonic's face on it, as well as numbered zones that were never used, like Zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. There's also a W icon, too. So clearly there was a lot of different features that were meant for these special zones that got scrapped at some point during development. And then after you beat the game, you can see that there's this whole exclusive area that the player can't normally access. Taking the camera out of bounds will show you that there's not a lot to this environment very, very quickly. In fact, this taller area doesn't even have anything on top. The game just assumes that you'll never actually get to reach up here, so it just kind of cuts off suddenly. And what's neat is that if you get to the end of the screen here, out of bounds, the large Sonic sprite that's supposed to pop up at the player will still go to its designated spot, so you could basically see a clipped version of the giant sprite. And although debug mode will not allow me to go all the way to the right here, the level editor can show you also that there's way more to the environment than the game lets on. You see the giant ring here on the screen. That's pretty much as far as the game's supposed to allow you to see. But as you may have noticed, there's practically a whole other screen, or maybe even 2 screens of environment that the player never gets to see. Now let's talk about something we never get to talk about on Boundary Break, but people on YouTube love talking about it. It's called parallax scrolling. So Sonic the Hedgehog does a fantastic job with parallax scrolling, and what you're looking at here is the background of Sonic the Hedgehog, and you might notice that the water is like white with blue speckles. Apparently the water in Sonic the Hedgehog is actually a blue void. And then they have sprites that are layered over the blue void. Now, here's how parallax scrolling works in Sonic 1. They take a singular image, and then they move certain slithers of the image at different speed intervals as you're moving across the screen to give the illusion of depth. I've painstakingly put lines in between each row that would show you, essentially, the cutoff points between all the different segments. But even better than that, I can replace the image of the background with something else from the game, and you can see like what would normally be a very standard image that has straight lines, and see how it gets cut up and moved around while you're moving, creating the parallax effect. Even if it doesn't look quite right, you can now see where it starts to lose its parallel shape. And keep it on that same topic, we'll talk about Hilltop Zone in Sonic 2. Now this one's really interesting. There is a lot of parallax scrolling, and one of the things I was really confused by is that there seems to be a sense of depth on the same layer. So like there's these blue hills all the way in the background, and they scroll faster than the brown hills in the foreground. And I was like, how does this work then? And I managed to figure this one out by putting the image of this particular part on the foreground and seeing that basically how this works is that these images are meant to animate. So this is not an effect of parallax scrolling, so much less that it's just an animated sprite that works in conjunction with parallax scrolling that's down below it. And then we got the bonus area for Sonic 2. If we remove the front layer where you're in that half tube, you can see that there's a lot more of the background than you would ever imagine. The details here are really surprising, and like I said, a lot of this just goes completely unseen by the player. Then there's this enemy here, and normally it's behind these bricks, and he does bust out of them, and he does have a couple of frames of animation where he's basically facing the camera. But if you select that particular enemy in the debug, you can see a frame of animation that never gets seen by the player because the bricks are usually covering it up. Then there's this enemy here that usually comes out of the lava. If you remove the layer that is covering up the enemy, you can see that there's a little bit more of the sprite than you would think. The body isn't fully animated or anything like that, but there's a lot more to the last link to his neck and a little bit of extra detail to the body that you normally can't see. Also, Dr. Robotnik here has this submarine, and the full entire sprite of the submarine is never seen by the player. So there's a lot of cool detail to the very bottom that is never seen. And then there's this enemy here. There's a detail to this enemy that is never used in the game, and when you access debug mode to select it, you can see that it has feet, which probably indicated at one point it was supposed to be standing on top of a surface, only to retract and become a jet. And then there's this enemy, I guess you would call it. It's the goop in this level that just kind of has cool patterns and stuff. Removing the layer that covers it up though, you can see where it starts and stops at any given time. This one in particular never goes away. It all just bundles up into one spot only to change its trajectory, while this other one sort of teleports from spot to spot. Now with Sonic 2, there wasn't a lot of stuff out of bounds, but one thing I found was that there was this random chunk of environment block right above where you finish the level. And what it's doing here makes no sense. There's no functionality to it, it's just there. Similarly, at the start of this level, you can see that there's just a random piece of environment that you can stand on top of. But what it's doing here doesn't really make sense either. There's no items or anything to collect. It's just floating in space. And lastly, you might notice these little icons with Dr. Robotnik's face on it. Well, in debug mode, when you activate it, it actually shows you the sprites for all the dev functions that some of these items or objects use. In the level editor, it will tell you what any given one of these icons actually do for any piece of environment or whatever. But yeah, when you see these, it's basically a physical representation of a script telling the game what to do, which in this case, it was moving these blocks left and right. And that's all I got for now. Thank you so much for watching. I have a ton of Sonic the Hedgehog episodes of Boundary Break, so if you're new here and you want to see a different Sonic game entirely covered on the show, chances are I've done it already, and you can take a look at it by going through this list. There are still just a select few games that are left in the Sonic franchise that I have not covered, so if you ever want to see those, by all means, give this a like, a comment, whatever you can do to support it will mean a lot. Anyways, I'm going to take off for now. Thank you so much for watching and take care.
I miss you.